this discussion about local communities, etc., kind of spurs in my mind maybe another approach, and maybe you folks in the panel can talk about this. Rather than come and try to get a national designation, another idea that I've heard discussed is to create, and I think it was with Mike, and it has to do with your tourism. Another approach might be to talk about this in terms of local community development and tourism. I know not from National Parks or Forest Service, there are programs within the federal government that look at supporting rural communities, and that's through tourism, through these historic things. That might be another approach. And I think, Mike, you had an idea that you discussed with me at one time. Maybe you can elaborate about having some kind of local tourism association, so we could get some federal funding to support it, state and local funding as well.
So before we go to Mike, any comments from other people who haven't had so much time to speak? Also, and Jenny's right there. But before I give, maybe let Jenny have a chance to talk.
No, go ahead.
But before I go to Jenny over there, I want to introduce Chris Turner. Stand up. He's with the American Indian Museum. He's a specialist in treaties. And so I think it's very treaties with, among other things. And so it's very timely when you mention this idea of the lands belonging to Native peoples from the very beginning, and all of what we do now still continues to affect that. Would you like to make a couple comments quick?
Just briefly. I won't be telling anybody anything new that they don't already know here, but immediately the project is all new to me, so I'm just considering some of the ways in which it sounds like very familiar efforts I've heard of before, but in some ways like none I've heard before because of the impact of the railway economically on tribal communities all over the West. We're really talking about two major ways in which this history might be of interest to them to bring to the fore to the public. The first is obvious, this has already been mentioned, the original lands that were used for the railroad, and whose it was and where it came from. The question, as Mike mentioned, of establishing ethnographically who it belonged to, but also ethnologically who it's related to. But I think the bigger question might be the second one, and that's economically, the impact of the railroad on all tribal communities in the West and even elsewhere. Because today, many of those communities are looking at the ways in which the impact of other types of physical barriers, such as pipelines, really are impacting their economic livelihoods and their health and wellness. And you'll find that these are the primary interests of tribal communities today. But establishing the connections for the public about how those things originated and how their communities became the way they are today. Isolationism and so forth. So I will mention briefly that if anybody has time, we do cover the first part, the history of the treaties that were the cessions that were made in California, which were the background for the original plans for the railroads in California in our treaties exhibit, which is called Nation to Nation in the museum. So if you get just a few moments to come over, you'll want to come over and kind of skip through about half of it because California's obviously pretty far into the treaty history that we tell there, which begins in the 1780s. So if you do get a few moments, come on down. I'll be with you tomorrow, so please stop, grab me if you have any comments to make. But I'll be kind of listening along and just considering what ways in which you might bring the conversation to the tribal communities that you're talking to, engage what their level of interest might be. I'm guessing that they will certainly have an interest in a kind of educational opportunity, as they always do, but bear in mind that they will have that kind of contemporary, we're looking at this right now, the incursions in their communities through types of projects that, such as pipeline projects, which are very similar in the types of ways in which those, their status is of a certain sort that normally defends against those kinds of things, but there's always exceptions to be made through the legislative efforts and so forth that eventually often win out. So they have that kind of historical perspective about these things. So anyway, I'm happy to be with you. Please grab me if you have any comments about that. Put some in. Thank you.
Okay, great. Be sure to use the time when you're Washington and go see the different museums, and it was great to have you here with us. And tomorrow there's going to be a big session about exhibits and how we develop engaging exhibits. So one of the specialists is there. Before we get back to Mike and talking about commercial relationships and historical preservation, I want to give a chance for Jenny and me.
Thanks, Ted. I'm Ginny Gong, and Michael Lynn and I both had the pleasure of serving as OCA's national president for a number of terms. I bring this up because I see that this is an issue that is not only significant to the Asian American community nationally, but to all of this entire country, and then at the same time there is a need to be respectful because it is also a local issue. The way we would have handled something like this in OCA, because we had chapters across the country, is that we would look at it and ask, is it strictly a local issue, because then the local chapter would deal with it? Is it a national issue, because then national would take over? Or is it both, where the local chapter might take the lead with the oversight by national, resources being provided, sensitivity to local issues, and at the same time, national could provide that kind of support. I think I see this as a combination of the latter. We really have to work very closely with the local community, the people, the business, everything, just to make sure that there is buy-in. But at the national level, you really need that level of leadership, connection to elected officials, connection to resources, and oversight, so that at the end, it's a well-orchestrated, organized effort, and there is clear lines of responsibility. So I think it's certainly a project that needs to move forward, but sort of multifaceted. So just 2 cents.
This will be real easy. I'd say what she said. Because you can't really have one without the other. It's not just purely local. And I kind of was going back to thinking a little bit that it's, what are you looking for? You definitely need something that says, what significance level is this? And have some attachment of significance. What is it that you're going to focus on? To me, that's very important. That decision needs to be made. What are the potential funding sources that come with whatever avenue that you're going to select, developing a strategy for that. And to me, then, there seems to be a lot of people power. I wouldn't worry on that part, but then the financial part, that's sort of the biggie that comes in. But again, that all depends on the scale of the scope of what you're trying to accomplish. And to me, those are critical next steps to focus on. I mean, are you going to focus on Summit Tunnel, or are you going to expand it a little more than that? And then the strategies accordingly will vary a little bit, with it.